Hey guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be talking about albuterol in the treatment of acute hyperkalemia. So let's jump into this one. All right, guys. So for hyperkalemia, we've already went through a few things as part of the cigar method. So we've talked about calcium, insulin, glucose. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit more about albuterol. And as we progress through all of this, you'll get to see the resin, loop diuretics, and sodium bicarbonate. And I've already touched on a little bit on sodium bicarbonate, but let us move forward more. So let's go ahead and talk about the mechanism of action. It's going to be pretty interesting because we've talked about how insulin is going to impact this sodium potassium ATPase. But the very interesting component of all of this is that albuterol is going to actually impact it in a different way. So I'm going to put up my little laser here, and we can see our beta agonists, our beta 2 agonists, they're going to have a receptor right here. But if we remember from prior in other agents that we use, like sodium bicarbonate, it's also going to work in this fashion that's going to actually impact the sodium component. It's going to go here. And as we go over to insulin, we'll see that the insulin binds here, the receptor goes off, and it's actually going to cause an upregulation and introducing potassium into the cell. But the cool thing is all of them is going to work on this sodium potassium ATPase. So that's a different way that albuterol and the beta agonists work. But I think it's interesting to note that the end result is going to be very similar amongst the different agents that we use for hyperkalemia. So let's go back and look at the dosing. It's going to be much larger than what we see in other indications at 10 to 20 milligrams. And depending on if you have this box here, you're going to see anywhere from 4 to 8 packets of this. And the volume can range anywhere from 0.5 to 3 mLs per 2.5. It is going to be given as a continuous infusion. The onset is going to be 20 to 60 minutes with a duration of 3 to 6 hours. And based off this being used as monotherapy, you can see a potassium reduction of 0.5 to 1 milliequivalents. So let's dive pretty quickly into some of the literature and just an overview of some of the literature that got us to this point. So this first study was done by Ali and colleagues. It was done in 1989. And what they wanted to do is determine the efficacy and safety of nebulized albuterol in the acute treatment of hyperkalemia in patients on chronic hemodialysis. It's going to be a similar trend that we see when discussing the treatments of hyperkalemia. The design was a prospective double-blind placebo-controlled study, and they looked at 10 patients, again, that were on HD and had chronic hyperkalemia. So what we found was that they used nebulized albuterol at either 10 or 20 milligrams compared to placebo. And what they found was that patients had a significant decrease in plasma potassium concentration. And this was found by 30 minutes, and it would sustain for at least 2 hours following the treatment of hyperkalemia with albuterol. An interesting component is they actually was able to, compute the exact level of potassium that was reduced. So with this 10 milligram dose, the maximum decrease in plasma potassium was 0.6 plus or minus there. And with the 20 milligram dose, we got very close to 1 millimole or 1 milliequivalent when using this. So this is one of our earlier studies that looked at this. Very intriguing study, not many patients. It's not something that we can say is all of our patients, but a large majority of our patients will be chronic HD patients. And I think it really was the foundation of when using some of these agents like albuterol. Another study was done by Lenz and colleagues, and what they looked at, and you will see this salbutamol is another way, again, we in America call it albuterol, but most of everyone else outside of the US used this term. Now I want to caveat, again, guys, this is the same exact chemical composition. It's the same exact product, it just has a different generic name. So very confusing for some of us in the US, but something that's pretty common for those outside. So Lenz and colleagues did this study comparing, and I'm just going to say albuterol or our beta 2 agonist for all of us listening. They compared this agent to insulin in 1989, and they wanted to see was there any difference in the efficacy and safety of each one of these products. An interesting component of us, this was the IV formulation of a beta 2 agonist, the IV formulation of what we call albuterol here in the US. In this prospective double-blind study, it was 45 patients on maintenance HD who also had hyperkalemia. So they had 3 groups. So I want to make sure we really get this one. At 3 groups, one of them received the IV beta-2 agonist, albuterol, and gave it over 15 minutes. The next group received our classical insulin plus glucose, and they received that. And then the last group got a combination of both of those. So what the authors found was that all treatments reduced serum potassium at a maximum of 30 or 60 minutes, and the range, the reduction was anywhere from 0.5 to 1.5 reduction in potassium from that baseline potassium level. Interestingly enough, the patients in the group C actually had a significantly greater reduction in potassium compared to group B, with 1.5 compared to 1 at 60 minutes, as we see here, and then at 180 minutes, it was 1.2 compared to 0.7. So there's another interesting study and something that shows that while we know, or we have a high prevalence of studies that show that insulin work, we also know now that the albuterol works as well in the IV formulation. This is just another study to show that we actually had IV albuterol at some point that was very popular, but I want to move to this next study that was done by Lienza and colleagues in 1992. And what they want to do is look at nebulized albuterol compared to placebo in these patients with hyperkalemia, and they looked at this in 15 patients, and this is a perspective of one study. They used 20 milligrams of this albuterol, and they compared it to placebo, and they did a great job of breaking this down and the reduction of potassium at certain time intervals. So we see a 20, 40, 60, 90, and 100 minute post, and we see the baseline in these patients were about 6.5. So we see a reduction to 5.8, to 5.5, to 5.4. Again, it stayed around 5.4, then sort of creep back up after 180 minutes. But I thought this was pretty significant. Those authors concluded that the decrease in potassium was significant at 40 minutes and maximum at 90 minutes, and persisted again for about 3 hours. The last thing we're going to talk about is this one done by Kim and colleagues in 1996. And what they did was they wanted to evaluate the efficacy in the combination therapy of sodium bicarbonate and this salbutamol for hyperkalemia patients, and only 9 of them. This is again a prospective crossover study. So they got multiple of these patients and they treated them at a certain time interval with one, and then crossed them over at a different time interval and to receive these different agents. So we use 8.4% sodium bicarbonate, and they used at 2 milligrams per kilo over half an hour. And they used our beta-2 agonist here, albuterol or salbutamol, and nebulized over 10 minutes. And then they used a combination therapy similar to what we saw in a previous study. And what they found was pretty interesting, and I have a few results here that report. The infusion of sodium bicarbonate induced a significant rise in sodium of serum bicarbonate levels, again for about 17 to 22, and the reduction of potassium was ineffective. So it was ineffective in lowering potassium, and the reduction we saw with that was 0.13. And I talk quite a bit in the next module about how come this may be the case, but I think it's pretty intriguing. So our beta-2 agonist did show a reduction in potassium of 0.57 compared to their baseline. And the combination therapy, it did actually increase the bicarbonate levels, but it also did show a very good reduction in plasma potassium levels at 0.96. Again, this is compared to the 0.57 by itself. So it appears to be a synergistic effect on the reduction of potassium. All right, guys, that's all I had. Thank you for watching this video.